Mr. Chips by Peter Kroger. Early evening thunder showers frequently sweep across Saskatchewan, providing a pleasant cooling from a hot afternoon sun. While a full rainbow arcs across the eastern sky, the warm earth radiates a refreshing odor that is enhanced by the ozone from the passing electrical storm. Our mission was to get the cows for the evening milking. Life was so exhilarating. We were easily distracted as we raced along cow paths through the trees to an old abandoned farm site. In an adjacent clearing there stood a lone, old dead poplar tree. Only a few branches remained near the top, and these housed a large nest that was occupied annually by a pair of red-tailed hawks. As we passed beneath the tree, there was a young bird lying on the ground, the down and partially developed feathers wet, matted, and disheveled. It was a young hawk, and dead. From above came the screeching of another hawk, and we were curious. My brother shinnied up the tree, clinging to the trunk and using the smallest of stubs from broken branches for footholds. When he reached the nest, he cautiously peered over the edge, ever conscious that an adult bird could be occupying the nest. There was another young hawk in the nest, and the adults were nowhere in sight. Avoiding the talons and beak, he removed the bird and tossed it down. I caught it. This young hawk was slightly larger than its sibling lying on the ground, but it was also only partially feathered. Carefully, in cupped hands, I carried it home. It had gotten rather late, and our parents were anxious to do the milking, so we snuck the hawk home undetected. It was a bird, so where would a logical place be to keep it? Why, with other birds. So we put it in the chicken coop. And it obviously needed to be fed, so we snuck into the basement, removed a package of hamburger from the deep freeze, and forced small chunks of the partially frozen meat into its gullet. Next morning, Father was feeding the chickens when he noticed the chickens crowded to one side of their roosts and this hawk perched at the other end. There is a cliché that would very aptly describe Father's reaction. That bird had to be moved. The chicken coop had 2 rooms, and the smaller room was not in use, so Mr. Chips moved in. Mother provided us with table scraps, and we supplemented his diet with hamburger from the deep freeze. Later that summer, we would experience the same cliché when Mother discovered her dwindling meat supply. Initially, Mr. Chips looked haggard, and it appeared he would succumb to our kindness. I'm not certain whether fried potatoes are a nutritional component of a hawk's diet, but soon he started to grow, and after several weeks developed into a normal-looking hawk. He intermingled with the chickens, and they accepted him. He probably thought he was a chicken. Curiously, Mr. Chips could roost with the chickens or strut about the yard with the chickens, and they showed no fear. Should a hawk fly overhead, and Mr. Chips attracted other hawks, the chickens would cower or scurry for cover. While still a fledgling, we had a severe rainstorm and our yard was flooded. There was a large pond in the middle of the yard, and Mr. Chips was wading about in the water. He discovered the biggest, longest earthworm he could ever imagine. He began swallowing, and then he would close his beak and arc his head back to tug on the worm, and then he would swallow repeatedly and again arc his head back to pull out more worm. There was no end to this worm. We were observing this performance from the breakfast table, and as amusing as it was, we perceived this could go wrong. I rushed out and pulled about 2 meters of baler twine out of his crop. Mr. Chips became a member of our family. Fearing, once he learned to fly, he would leave, Father showed us how to clip one wing to prevent him from flying. This lasted for a while, but the feathers grew back, and Mr. Chips did learn to fly. He would disappear sometimes for days, but would always return. A favorite habit early in the morning was to land on the windowsill of our second-story bedroom and scream at us. He had a fierce expression that belied his pleasant nature. His vision always amazed us. I caught a mouse that I was going to feed him. Mr. Chips was nowhere in sight. I held this mouse by the tail at arm's length and called him. There was a loud scream, and before I had time to react, he sank his talons into my arm as he landed and plucked that mouse from my fingers. A mature caragana hedge encircled my grandmother's house, and there was a large lilac bush in the corner, and Mr. Chips had been in the garden on the other side of the hedge and bush when I had called. With a few wing beats he dove onto my arm as only a raptor could. It was mid-afternoon when Father called me and directed my sight down the lane leading toward the country road. "What is Chips doing?" Standing in the middle of the lane, he was bent forward and peering at the ground. Suddenly he would bend down and peek at the ground, jerk upright, and then snap his head back and open his beak. We moved closer to observe this strange behavior. Mr. Chips was undeterred by our presence and continued with this activity. He was standing over an anthill. As the ants came out of the hole, he would scoop them up with the tip of his beak, flip them in the air, and catch them. It was fall. Mother had established a clientele with some Air Force personnel that were engaged in maneuvers at the local armed forces base. That evening they drove onto our yard to pick up some eggs they had ordered. As we were standing by their vehicle and chatting, I happened to look in the back seat of their car and burst into tears. Lying on the floor, covered in blood, was our beloved Mr. Chips. Well, we saw him sitting on a post in your backyard and thought we'd shoot him before he attacked your chickens. As he flicked his eyes, they gazed into the distance, sending arrows piercing into a young boy's heart. They took him to the local veterinarian, but there end our stories of Mr. Chips.